Okay, hello everybody. Can you hear me okay? All right, so this is the 13th annual Joshua and Verona Whatmough Memorial Lecture that I'm welcoming you to. Not the first time I'm doing that. The Whatmough Lectures are a kind of institution now. They were established by a gift of the Whatmough family, and especially the late Mrs. Verona Taylor Whatmough. The history of the Harvard Linguistics Department will always be linked to the name of Professor Joshua Whatmough, who came to Harvard from the UK, his native land, by way of a stint of Latin teaching in Egypt in 1926. By the time he retired from Harvard in 1963, he had been successively professor of the classics, then professor of comparative philology, and beginning in 1951, professor of linguistics. He was the first member of the Harvard faculty to bear that title. He was the founder of the Department of Linguistics that we have today. His development from a classicist to a linguist was reflected in his work. He began as a specialist in Latin, Italic, and Gaulish inscriptions, but he shifted over the course of his career to language more centrally. He was especially interested in the use of information theory and other mathematical tools as an aid to the study of language, as reflected in his 1955 book called Language, a Modern Synthesis. Joshua Whatmough died in 1964, less than a year after his retirement, but he was survived by his wife Verona, through whose generosity these lectures were established, and by their children Jeremy Whatmough and the late Theodora Whatmough Green, as well as by their grandchildren. Today we welcome back Jeremy Whatmough after a gap of several years, and Fred Green, the original Whatmough couple's son-in-law. We also have 4 Whatmough grandchildren with us: Alan with his wife Kathy, Phil, Carol, and Elizabeth. This is one of the largest family contingents we've had, and all are, of course, very welcome. All right, now we're going to move to the more academically focused part of today's proceedings, but before we do, let me remind you that after the lecture and question period, there will be a reception on the ground floor of the Harvard Faculty Club, which is a couple of minutes walk away, and everybody's welcome. All right, so now I'd like to introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Claire Bowern, and I'm going to do that myself rather than calling upon a distinguished colleague, because Claire is really, well, was once my student. Other grads of this department have been Whatmough lecturers, but none who were students within semi-recent memory. Claire came to Harvard in 1999, finished in 2004, and is now professor of linguistics at Yale. She grew up in Australia and started her college career at ANU, Australian National University. Classics, as for Professor Whatmough, was her original field of study, but she discovered linguistics by taking a course in it and quickly realized that this is what she wanted to do. One of her professors, Harold Koch, who was also a graduate of this department but teaches at ANU and has had his career there, encouraged her to apply her historical linguistic training to an indigenous Australian language family, and before long she was doing field work too and had made contacts with an indigenous community. By the time she came to America in 1999, she already had a budding career. Some of you may know that the languages of Australia, well, let me put it another way, the Australian continent is mostly covered by languages belonging to the very large Pama-Nyungan family. All the genetic diversity in Australia is in the north, where there are a number of unrelated families that are sometimes collectively referred to as non-Pama-Nyungan. Claire's original work was on such a language, Bardi, a member of the Nyulnyulan family. Her Harvard dissertation was called Bardi, Verb Morphology and Historical Perspective, but that was just an artificial trimming down of a full grammar, which she eventually wrote. It was published in 2012, and when it came out, it was her second book, because her first book was a work called Linguistic Fieldwork, A Practical Guide, which came out in 2008. It's a very useful book. By then, Claire had moved from her first job at Rice University in Texas to Yale. She was promoted to associate prof in 2010, and in 2017 to full professor, and I might mention that she also had 2 kids in that period. She lists her research areas as morphology, field linguistics and language documentation, historical linguistics, linguistic variation, and that barely begins to cover everything she actually does. She's become, among other things, the face of Australian linguistics in North America. Besides doing her own research, she takes very seriously the documentation side of field work, which means, among other things, learning how to make use and make sense of materials collected by well-meaning amateurs and sometimes not so well-meaning professionals from long ago. She's the main developer of a database of the languages of Australia, which goes by the acronym CHIRILA. It stands for Contemporary and Historical Reconstruction in the Indigenous Languages of Australia. But really, that name CHIRILA is kind of the word for echidna in a lot of Australian languages, so it's cute, and it has a very pretty logo. She also started an archive platform analogous to academia for Australian languages and linguistics. A big part of working on indigenous languages anywhere in the world is figuring out the phylogenetic relations among them. The traditional comparative method that Indo-Europeanists have used for a long time is still the best way to get reliable results, but for that you need a level of knowledge that usually isn't available, and it's slow. You usually don't have the time either. So for practical purposes, there are computational methods, which are very useful if you know how to use them, but that demands linguistic as well as technical sophistication. Claire is one of a small number of historical linguists who have ventured into this territory. She has an article co-authored with Quentin Atkinson called Computational Phylogenetics and the Internal Structure of Pama-Nyungan, which appeared in Language 6 years ago. Which was a milestone in this area. Another kind of evidence comes from the human genome, which is increasingly coming into use as an available technology. And here, too, she's gotten her feet wet, so to speak, as one of the authors of a 2016 article in Nature called A Genomic History of Aboriginal Australia. However, high-tech methods are not the subject of today's lecture. As I said a minute ago, being concerned with documentation means knowing how to make sense of materials that were put together a long time ago by people with varying degrees of preparation and varying agendas. Today's talk will be, you might say, an extended dilation on that last point. So let me now hand things over to Professor Bowern, whose title is The Mysterious Taensa Grammar, Imaginative Fiction, or Poor Description.
Okay, thanks very much, Jay, and thank you all for coming. As Jay mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the mysterious Taensa grammar today. And this talk is not about Australian languages, it's about a potential Native American language of the Southeast. This is material that was published in the late 19th century, in the early 1880s, and since then has garnered a reputation as being a potential really good example of a hoax. And so I want to come back and examine the hoax status of this material today, and look a bit at how this material might be relevant to what we think about when we think about language documentation. So in order to do that, I want to start by just talking a bit about language documentation. So what is it that we do when we say we document a language? Well, of course, we work with native speakers or native signers of a language. We work with the archival materials if there are no native speakers available. This could be audio materials, it could be print work, it could be manuscript materials like this. This is the only Bardi you'll see today, but this is Bardi from the 1920s. And we do this, of course, not just because we can, but we do this in order to answer questions about linguistic structure. So we're interested in how languages work and what languages tell us about the mind, and language documentation is a good way to get insights into that. For historical linguists, we, of course, also want to know just not only what synchronic linguistics looks like and what the synchronic language structures are, but how they've changed over time, and also what those language structures tell us about the populations that speak those languages. So, of course, we can use language material to infer ancient population movements, migrations, borrowings between related and unrelated languages, and so on and so forth. So doing archaeology with language is a very rich source of material about the past. And of course, we also want to work with endangered language communities, and an increasing source of work for linguists is transferring materials like this basically illegible Bardi notebook from the 1920s into something that could be used in a school program or used for community members who are interested in their heritage languages but don't speak it anymore. As more of the world's languages become endangered, a much larger percentage of our work on languages is going to be not through native speakers, but rather through the sorts of archival materials that have been recorded by various others over the last couple of hundred years. So this, for example, is a screenshot or a couple of stitched together screenshots of different parts of the world from endangeredlanguages.com, which is a compilation of information about how different languages are endangered to different degrees across the world. And you can see there are a number of hotspots here. Papua New Guinea, for example, is both home to a large number of languages and a very large number of endangered languages. Northern parts of South America also. For the US, basically all Native American languages in the US are endangered. The only reason there aren't more dots on this map is that some are already extinct. And even in Europe, of course, we see a number of endangered languages and dialects and varieties as well. And so as we spend more time working with materials, with languages through archival materials, we need to know how to work with those materials. Working with a piece of paper is not the same as asking questions of a native speaker or signer of a language. And so we need to know what these language materials have as advantages and disadvantages and what they represent. So let's think for a moment about what we do when we do language documentation. So I've mentioned the broad scale of language endangerment and so on. When we actually document a language, we describe the sounds, the words, meanings, structures, and so on of language in terms of a meta-language. So linguistics is one of these odd fields that uses its object of study in order to describe itself. This has been perhaps characterized by a cartoonist who illustrated Kennedy, the author of the Revised Latin Primer, as leading the gerundive into captivity. So we're trying to figure out what the structures of the language are that we're looking at and how to characterize them. Over the last 50 years or so, this characterization has taken the form of a relatively well agreed on set of meta-language terminologies. We might call this functional typology. If I talk about an ergative language, then that will conjure up ideas about what sorts of structures this language has, and also what sorts of structures it doesn't have. If I talk about an adjective apical stop, you'll probably know I'm talking about and not say a f or something like that. And this has settled down pretty much over the last 50 years or so, but when we're dealing with historical materials, particularly from the 19th century, there was no real common standard, or if there was, that standard was rather Latin grammars of the type that Kennedy wrote. So they look at the sorts of structures that are known from Latin, and also what the language describers or workers knew from the languages they knew, such as French or Spanish or occasionally Hebrew or Russian, and they described the unfamiliar language in those terms. And so this introduces a number of artifacts into the material, and also means that we have no real common meta language that we can work from, and we get a number of oddities that are introduced to the materials from those terms. Now, documentation is hard, and it's not just because of the meta-language that we end up with errors or oversights or materials that are subject to refinement. So, for example, we find the wrong analysis sometimes. So, for example, a language documenter who is accustomed to seeing adjectives in their native language, when confronted with a language that has no separate class of adjectives, but rather a set of, say, stative verbs, will nonetheless often describe the language as having a class of adjectives and then go to great extent to define the adjectives in terms of the verbal classes that they see, rather than recognizing that adjectives are not a functional class as we would do today. We see things like Niels Homer's work, where he found two different R sounds, a R sound and a trill sound in some languages of Eastern Australia, and decided that he thought it was implausible that any language would use those two sounds to make a difference in meaning, and so decided not to further notate them, and just thought that they were in free variation or something. Whereas, of course, in just about all the languages of Australia, apart from the languages right on the coast, two R sounds do make a difference in meaning. So in Bardi, for example, ara means other or something like that, and ara is the negator that means no or nothing. So the difference between these two R sounds is crucial. We have examples of language documentation coming up with the wrong meaning. One of my favourites is the word lists of Tasmanian Aboriginal languages, where words for you, for the second person pronoun, are often confused with the word for nose. So if a language documenter points to a person and says, what's the word for you? They could be pointing at the nose. You also get this sometimes for the word for me when they're pointing to themselves. You get nose. You also get finger as a word that is found meaning nose or you, of course, from what they're pointing at. And this sort of stuff, of course, works itself out in a long-term documentary project, but for someone who's only working with a language for a very short period of time, these errors make their way into the tradition, only to be discovered 100 or so years, 200 in some cases years later, when you have the comparative materials to work with those items. And finally, sometimes we even get the wrong language when we're doing language documentation. For example, there's a grammar of an Australian language published under the name of Galali. This was the language that was elicited, but the speaker of this language was actually speaking a related language, Wankumara, at the time, and he spoke a number of languages. Wankumara was his favourite language, and so he answered all the questions in that language, even though the documentary linguists had asked for Galali, and this was only discovered once comparative materials for a closely related language became available. And we have a number of these types of materials as throughout the record. Australia is not unique in any way in these types of documentary issues. So, in addition to all of the problems of language documentation, we also have the fakes. And I wanted to bring this up because, of course, Taensa is one of the most celebrated fakes of the 19th and 20th century. I wanted to mention one other. So, in this case, we have George Salmanazar, who was active in the early 18th century. He described himself as the first Formosan to visit Europe. He invented the Formosan alphabet, he translated the Lord's Prayer into Formosan, and he dined out on first the stories of the Formosan language, and then subsequently the stories of the fakery of the Formosan language after he was shortly discovered to be a trickster of the first water, we might say. And so he was able to build a career in the courts of Western Europe by first coming up with these language materials and then subsequently talking about the materials as a fake themselves. And so this fakery brings us to the Taensa affair. Today I'm going to talk about the anatomy of this hoax and the protagonists, the people who are accused of creating the materials. I'm going to give you a review of the evidence, not the whole lot, otherwise we'd be here all night, but some selected key points. And then I want to move to my claims here, which are that there's more to the story than has been traditionally assumed with the Taensa materials. And in particular, that there are some materials, some features of the materials which are inconsistent with the standard hoax theory, which might suggest that either the materials are not a hoax as constructed in the way that people have claimed over the last 120 years, or that they are in fact genuine representations of a natural language. So, first of all, the Taensa Material. So, our story in brief, we start in eastern France, in Plombières, which is in the far eastern, sorry, I don't have a cursor, but you see on the map that green blob is France, the red rectangle is Paris, and then the blob to the east is Plombières. I have here a contemporary postcard in the northeast from the 1880s, and the Google Street View of the same region, just a little further down the same street. So this is the street that our protagonist, our main protagonist, Jean Pais, lived on. So Jean Pais was a seminary student. He was 19 or 20 years old at the time, so undergraduate sort of age. He was working in his grandfather's library. His grandfather was the mayor of Plombières, and he had died a couple of years before. And while working in this library, he discovered an undated, anonymous manuscript grammar of the Taensa language. So Taensa is a Native American group from northeastern Louisiana. I'm going to tell you a bit about them in a couple of minutes. And this grammar was written in Spanish. And his grandfather had made some preliminary translations of some of the documents. Now, Pais published these fragments in the early 1880s. There are three publications in 1880, 81, and 1882. So these are the materials. In 1880, we get this notes on the language of the Taensas in the Revue des Linguistiques. And then in 81, we get this anonymous publication of the texts of 12 Taensa songs, as they're called, the Taensa Gini Changagi, which is the Taensa plural emphatic song plural, which are published without further context. And we get these, we just get the Taensa and the French translations. And then in 1882, we get a grammar, text, and dictionary published under the names of Amante, who was the grandfather, Pais, and Lucien Adam, who was an Americanist who you'll also hear about in a little while. This material has about 600 words or so of vocabulary. It has short texts and a couple of prayers with commentary on the forms of those materials. And it has a 41-page grammar, which covers the basics that you would expect for a grammar of this type. It's got some phonology, it's got a bit of morphology, it's got a tiny bit of syntax, it's got some stylistic comments. And this is based on the 1880 notes with some expansions. It's about twice the length of the 1880 documents. Okay, and that's it. This is the entire corpus of Taensa as we know it from this form. Now, as you might imagine, a set of documents like this that turn up in eastern France in the 1880s of a language that was supposedly extinct for more than a century, almost 2 centuries at this point, aroused a certain amount of interest and, by 1885, a certain amount of suspicion as well. So Daniel Brinton published this Taensa Grammar and Dictionary, A Deception Exposed, in 1885. Throughout 1885 and early into 1886, there was a subsequent back and forth of letters between Brinton, Lucien Adam, Pais, Vincent, and a couple of other noted European linguists, each side digging themselves in further, you might say. And then there was an impasse by the late 1885, early 1886, and the matter basically rested there. Neither side was convinced by the other. Neither side had produced proof that was definitive or satisfactory to the other. Swanton in 1908 publishes a follow-up note that proves that the Taensa Indians spoke the Natchez language, which looks nothing like the materials that Pais had published, and that was seen to be the definitive evidence that this material was a hoax. And since then, no one has claimed anything other than the Taensa materials are a fake, a hoax, or something along those lines. So, for example, Jack Martin in 2004, Daniel Kaufman in his 2014 dissertation, Lyle Campbell in his 1997 compilation book on the languages of Native America, Landau, William Sturtevant, and so on, all are unanimous in saying that the Taensa language is a hoax. It was brought to the attention of the hoax was uncovered by Brinton, and the matter has rested there. Okay, so let's now move to talking a bit about the protagonists. Part of establishing a hoax or a fake is to talk about who could have done this. And what sort of opportunity they had. So, Dominic Amante who died in 1872, was the mayor of Plombières. He wrote this book on the town, Plombières, Ancient and Modern. It's freely available on Google Books. It's quite an interesting read if you like that sort of thing. He was interested in the world. He was an educated man who was interested not just in the history of the town he lived and had grown up in, but was also interested in the wider world. So he had a large library, and he kept the mayoral house as somewhat of a salon where travelers from elsewhere would come and visit. And that's basically all we know about him, as far as I can tell. Jean Parisot, who I mentioned was a seminary student at the time of the Taensa affair, was a scholar of Syriac. He did fieldwork, language documentation, ethnographic documentation. He has a book on chant and chanting practices. He has a number of works on the history of the church, and he was a Benedictine priest and died in 1923. At the time of the exposure of the Taensa affair, he was actually on fieldwork in Turkey. And was working with looking at Syriac documents and looking at Syriac and Middle Aramaic materials of that type, and writes from basically from the field that he'd been away essentially without access to letters for a number of years. So, as far as we know, his only work with Native American work was this Taensa grammar. Everything else has been about Syriac and the early church fathers and history of the church. Lucien Adam, on the other hand, was very much an Americanist. He did comparative work on a number of languages of both North and South America, of Algonquian, of Miskito, Carib, Tupi, but also Manchu and local French dialects. He ran a series of publications that published materials for earlier documents, so early missionary records, early missionary grammars. For example, the first Timucua grammar was published in his series, and he encouraged Parisot to publish this Taensa grammatical material as well. So the 1882 book appeared in his series and appeared with him as a co-editor along with Amante and Adam. So with that, those are the people who were the possible candidates for fakers, and of those, Lucien Adam is above suspicion. So we're basically left with Parisot as the possible perpetrator of this hoax. So with that, let's move now to who the Taensa were. So the Taensa are mentioned early in descriptions of North America. This map is from 1718. It's the de Lille's map. This red dot here is, you can see this map is well and truly not to scale, but the dot here is the Taensa area between the Mississippi River and the Red River in northern Louisiana. You can see a similar dot on the blown up portion of the map on the left as well. So it says Taensas there. Our first record of the Taensa are in La Salle's expedition of 1682, and they're described in more detail in 1686. We know they came from somewhere further north than here. So this Google map again shows you modern-day Tensas Parish in Louisiana. in the northeast corner of Louisiana, around Lake St. Joseph, again between the Red River and the Mississippi. They moved several times in the course of the 18th century between this area and further south, as far as Bayou Gula and a number of towns along the Mississippi. And by the 1800s, by the early 1800s or so, they have merged with two other groups, the Natchez and the Chichimacha, and from that time, they basically disappear from the record as an independent body, independent entity. These days, there is the Taensa Hoax tribe of northeastern Louisiana, and their tribal lands are around this area as well. So they're mentioned, I guess, mentioned in dispatches, you might call them, from the 1701 or so onwards for about 100 years, and then we don't see any further record of the Taensa as an independent entity. So let's now review the arguments for the hoax. So I've mentioned a number of times that these Taensa materials were assumed from the 1880s to have been a hoax. Daniel Brinton argued that this was a trick perpetrated by students, Pais and a colleague, although I can find no information about the colleague other than what Brinton suggests. These were constructed language and subsequently an authored grammar designed to trick Americanists for some reason not given. The reasons he gives for the hoax are basically three. Unusual typological features, so features of the Taensa language that we don't find in other Native American languages, particularly of the region. Implausible vocabulary, such as words for ice and maple in Louisiana, words like sugarcane, bananas, rice, and so on. And thirdly, that the Taensa are known, he says, to speak the Natchez language, and given that the Taensa materials we have here look nothing like Natchez, that provides further evidence that these materials must have been faked. So let me now go through these arguments in a bit more detail. So I'm going to start with the typology material. So he mentions that gender is a feature that's unknown in North America. The Taensa grammar gives us two genders, a noble gender, which is unmarked, and a non-noble gender, i.e. feminine, so masculine versus feminine is how Pais describes it. The non-noble marker is a long A, so R on nouns. Underived nouns, so nouns derived from verbs don't receive this marking. Animal names get it, personal names get it, animate names and some other nouns receive this marker as well. Brinton argues that this is unusual for languages of the region. We also find three forms of the plural, which he says is unknown for Native American languages. And there are some other features as well: base 10 numeral systems, relative clauses, and a couple of other features. Now, neither of these features is particularly good evidence for typological oddity. It's true that gender systems are particularly dual, two-category gender systems are not very common in North American languages. But those that we do see are found precisely in this region. Some Iroquoian languages, for example, have a form of this type. For the three forms of the plural, what we find here is not three distinct plural types, but rather a number of different allomorphs of the plural. So the plural varies depending on the form of the word that it attaches to. So sometimes you get G, sometimes you get K, sometimes you get Y. So if the word ends in an R, for example, you get a Y. This yin, so the ini form is a separate suffix that can go on after the plural that Pais didn't realize and describe separately. So there aren't three forms of the plural. There is one form of the plural, but it has three different forms depending on the word that comes before it. And this is utterly standard for languages the world over. Basically, all languages have some sort of allomorphy or some sort of variation of this type. Brinton also talks about similarities to French and or Spanish. So he presumes that the publication of the grammar, the 1882 publication, is a translation into French of the original Spanish manuscript, and says that that this is extremely suspicious. So if If he did not, the writer of the original manuscript must have been a pretty good linguist for his day, since he explains the pronunciation of the Taensa by French, English, German, and the Spanish. So, for example, we get the Taensa grammar has this character in it, and it's described as being like the th in English, thin, for example. I suppose the references on page 11 to Nahuatl, Quechua, and Algonquian tongues are by the translator, though we're not so told. At any rate, they are someone who has given someone who has given a certain amount of study to American languages and could get up one not wholly unlike them. So he treats these materials as being both extremely suspicious, implausibly well-read for a Spanish missionary of the 17th century, but also simultaneously showing enough knowledge of Native American languages that someone could fake them. Okay, so this is one of Brinton's arguments. We know, however, from the subsequent examples, subsequent back and forth letters between Adam, Pais, and Brinton, that the materials we have, the French grammar of 1882, is not actually a straight translation of the materials that Pais said he came across. In fact, we know that there were subsequent editorial editions made by both Pais and Adam. The ones from Adam are mentioned, at least in general terms, in the introduction to the 1882 grammar. The Pais ones come out separately. So, for example, we know that he rearranged the vocabulary and he added words. He mentions that many of the original words were not translated in the original Spanish manuscripts, and so he guessed at a translation of them. He expanded the description of the materials. And therefore, I would say we don't really know what's original out of the manuscript. So we could treat it as a document that has been subsequently editorially improved, or we could treat this as further obfuscations of and evidence of fakery. At the very least, it's poor documentary practice, but that's maybe all it is. We do have a lot of evidence in this material for a French meta-description. For example, the sequence GN in this grammar is treated as a digraph, so it's listed amongst the digraphs, and we're told that this digraph describes a cluster. So someone who is familiar with French, of course, knows that the GN sequence is the palatal nasal. It's a ny sound, but Pais goes out of his way to show that the GN is not the ny sound in the Taensa materials. It's a gn, like in German, as he says. But the treating of this material as a digraph and as something special, unlike say the KT sequence, which he does not treat as a digraph. That's just a cluster of consonants. Shows that the writer of this grammar is working very much with a French mindset, within a French meta language. We see other examples of this as well. So, for example, we get case prefixes. These prefixes are described as prepositions, so the accusative and dative, accusative me and dative ke, or just the single consonant. But these are described in terms of prepositions, even though elsewhere in the grammar, Pais makes a distinction between prepositions and affixes, or independent words and affixes. So this overall leaves one with the impression that there's a certain amount of lack of meta-linguistic awareness, we might say. But of course, meta-linguistic awareness is exactly what's required for the hoax theory to succeed. Hoaxes don't work unless they're obviously discovered unless there's some meta-linguistic awareness for the hoaxes. They need to use the language in order to create a different language. So let me move on now to lexicon and talk about some of the words that Brinton found suspicious. So first of all, he claims that ice and maples and a number of other things are not found in Louisiana. And that's true, of course, that they're not found in southern Louisiana, but they are found in northern Louisiana. So this maple, for example, is a Louisiana maple. It was Pinterest and Instagram are great now for finding examples of trees from particular areas. And the fact that ice and maple are found in northern Louisiana was pointed out even by Swanton 100 years ago. This ice picture was taken from an ice storm in Louisiana in 2015. So the argument that this grammar refers to items that are not found in the relevant region is simply not true. We could think about acculturation terms, so terms like bananas, rice, potatoes, apple, sugarcane, and so on. These, of course, would be very suspicious if the date of the materials is very early. So if it's pre-17th century, or if it's in the early years of La Salle and so on, then this would be extremely suspicious. But we don't know. We simply don't know the date of the source of the Spanish manuscript. It would be anachronistic if early, but not if later. And one might argue that given that the material contains translations of prayers and so on, that implies a later date rather than an earlier one. In which case, acculturation terms would be fine. So the Timucua grammar for grammar and dictionary, for example, from the 17th century, contains a number of ecclesiastical terms. It contains terms of this type. I think there's a word for rice in there, and so on. This simply leaves us with problems like the word for ours blanc, so polar bear. No polar bears in Louisiana, and so this is unlikely to be. This is either pretty good evidence for fakery of some sort, or perhaps it's simply a translation error, and our white bear here is not a polar bear. It's say a black bear with a shining coat, as some Louisiana black bears tend to have. They have what's it called, a morphology that includes a grey sheen. Okay, so let's continue talking about lexicon now, but let's move to potential similarities to other languages of the region. Something that Brinton mentioned was that the Taensa material seems to show no similarities to other languages that we might expect to see. So no Choctaw, no Mobilian jargon, no Natchez, as far as we can see. And so this absence is extremely suspicious for materials that are supposed to be of a Native American language of this region and this time. And it's true, as far as I can tell, there are no Choctaw loans, no Mobilian loans, one Natchez form, which I'll talk about in a little bit. I also found a potential Spanish loan, so the word for sumac in the material is given as anado, which looks pretty similar to anato. And if you look at the sumac berries and anato berries, they look pretty similar. The seed cases, of course, look totally different, but once you get the seeds, they look very similar. If we look at lookalikes with surrounding languages, there are a couple of forms that look very similar to Timucua, which is a language from quite a bit further east, from Florida and into Georgia. So we have the Taensa word serup, word for bird, which looks pretty similar to the Timucua word chulofi. We have yeha for one, Timucua yaha, and we have this word for bear, sokop, in Taensa, which looks very similar to chokop in Natchez. I've given you a couple of other words that look perhaps somewhat similar. These are words, if you're trawling a bunch of word lists and looking for anything that looks remotely similar, I would argue that these fall above the bounds of looking remotely similar, but I would not want to stake too much on any of them, whereas the top three look like pretty good potential matches. But that, of course, raises a question about what the status of such matches is. So if these were not mentioned in any of the 19th century sources, even though both Adam and Brinton knew about Timucua, they had published Timucua sources. Brinton had done work on Timucua, and they also weren't mentioned by Pais in his defense of the Taensa material, which is odd if this were a hoax and the Timucua forms or the Natchez forms were planted as ways to add verisimilitude to an otherwise faked material. All right, so I would argue that this is an argument in favor of these materials actually being genuine, or at least it's very surprising that we would have this number of coincidences for forms of this type. Okay, so if they're plants or if they're forms that are put in this material to make the grammar or the materials look more realistic, you would think that Adam and Pais would be falling over themselves to point them out if they hadn't been noticed. But no one mentioned them, and I think that's quite odd, unless these are indications of something that's perhaps genuine. Okay, at this point, let me move to some other arguments. So I mentioned that Brinton said we knew that Taensa spoke Natchez. Probably the best example of this quote, or this argument comes from Swanton, who says that, who looks at the sources from the early 1800s and argues that they show conclusively that missionaries in the region were working with Natchez, they were working with Taensa, and they consider these populations to speak the same language. And so he says, consequently, the language derived from or through Monsieur Pais is not Taensa and was probably never spoken by anyone whatsoever. Now, of course, just because the Taensa spoke Natchez doesn't mean that they spoke only Natchez. And one of the hallmarks, one of the features of Native American communities of the southeast of the US was multilingualism. So we know a lot about regional contact languages such as Mobilian jargon and Choctaw and Natchez as well to some extent. And so the idea that just because one group spoke this language, it doesn't mean that that was the only thing they spoke. In particular, we know that this group was quite fragmented even by the late 17th century. So they're building stockades in the late 1680s. This whole region was devastated by smallpox around this time, and so it's not implausible that remnant groups of speakers speaking languages that were not otherwise known and otherwise related to other languages might have been amalgamated and absorbed into other tribes. In fact, we know that was the case with a number of different groups. In fact, we have 5 or 6 groups that where we don't know anything about their languages other than the names on the map. We know that maybe their towns had Chickasaw names or Choctaw names, but the small amount of vocabulary we have from those languages implies that these languages, groups did not speak languages related to Choctaw or Chickasaw. So Taensa, in that sense, fits right into to the southeast of the 17th and 18th centuries. One argument that very much speaks in favor of the hoax theory is the manuscript tradition. So I mentioned that Pais translated and published this manuscript in Spanish from that was found in his grandfather's papers. The original manuscript has never been produced. As you can imagine, much of this material would be solved with an appeal to this manuscript. Many people have been asking for it over the 20 years or so between Parisot's publication and Swanton's work. Parisot, they asked for it. Parisot didn't reply. He was first of all in Turkey at the time. They got his father involved, and you know when you bring the parents in, it's serious. His dad looked for it, couldn't find it. When Parisot returned from Turkey, he said he hadn't seen it for 3 years. He'd been traveling, and so there the matter seems to have rested. I do not know whether Parisot's papers survive. I'm actually trying to find that out at the moment. But in any case, we don't have the manuscript. The fact that it couldn't be produced in the 1880s is extremely suspicious. Although of course things do go missing, particularly with young scholars whose primary interests might be elsewhere. So we can spin a story that suggests that that can explain away the lack of the manuscript, but this is curious to say the least, and sketchy might be a better word to describe it. Let's now turn to Jean Parisot's linguistic competence. So I've mentioned several times that the materials of the Taensa materials are reasonably extensive. We have 12 texts or so, and they have features of morphological interest and phonological and syntactic interest. And so the person who created them probably needed to have known something about linguistics and be a reasonably good linguist. So the question is, was Parisot a good linguist? Not really, according to his co-author, who Louisiana, who publishes, who writes in the letter that Monsieur Pais is very eager and he's keen and so on, but he's not very adroit, so could not have the. And Adam is arguing that he could not have had the competence to fake the materials, and if you look at the grammar, this feeling of young, enthusiastic, and so on, but actually not very competent, is confirmed by the grammar. I'd say it's maybe a B-, maybe a C+ as a final senior project of that sort. I'm going to very briefly go through some of the errors in the manuscript, or some of the points that strike you as being inconsistent, which a more experienced linguist might not have created, and certainly things that the creator of the language should have known in their description of the materials. So if you remember, the materials include not only the grammar but also the Taensa text, and so these two things should be consistent if they're written by the same person. So, for example, we have all these plural forms that I mentioned before: the ji, gi, gin, gini, ki, etc., and yi. And these are listed as the forms of the plural marking, but there are also forms given right below within the same paragraph of plurals in ogi. And so he's both exhaustively listing the possible forms and then also giving other forms that he doesn't actually talk about. And so that's at the very least an inconsistency. He mixes up cases and prepositions. I also mentioned this before. Some forms are never fully glossed. He mentions them. He gives, for example, this tue as a case marker, and then under the prepositions, he gives it as a preposition that marks case, and then only from the text do we find that it's probably some sort of instrumental marker. He glosses over similarities in morphology. So one of the reasons he has all of these different plural forms is some of them have gi, some of them have gini, some of them have ki, some of kini, yin, yini, and so on, or yi, yini. But he also has this augmentative suffix, which is ini, and some sort of focal or emphatic marker, which is also ini. And the examples he gives look very much like these are one and the same morpheme, yet he's describing them in different places. He has a distinction between derivational and inflectional morphology, which is of course nice to see, and he uses this to provide information about the grammar. So derivational morphology does not show agreement across a noun phrase, whereas inflectional morphology does. So if you have, for example, the little song, then you would have, or something like the Red River, or the small red river, then river would have a diminutive marker on it, but red would not. Whereas if we're talking about to the Red River, you would have the ke marker on both red and on river. So that's what spreading of inflectional morphology but not derivational morphology means. And so they mention that there's a distinction, but then they don't apply the distinction consistently in the table. So they give tables of affixes which include both derivation and inflectional items, and you have to kind of tease apart what's going on. He also has a bit of a problem with irregularity. So he will call verbs irregular if they show morphophonological alternations. So things like glide formation, even though those rules themselves are irregular. So it seems like for him, verbs are only regular if they don't ever alternate, if they don't show any difference depending on what tense markers they occur with. But the rules he gives are at least quasi-regular. There are a couple of exceptions in some places. So these are not necessarily errors, but they're inconsistencies and things that are unexpected if the author of the grammar is the same as the person who came up with the materials. But they're utterly consistent with early documents of writers who know something about language, but are making their first attempt to describe language as in terms of a linguistic meta-language. We have another number of other generalizations that the grammar overlooks, and so let me mention a couple of these as well. So, for example, there are a number of words that appear with and without an initial vowel. So we have the word for ear, varta, and we also have this as avaratal. But the A comes and goes. This actually occurs with all vowels. I just gave you a couple of examples from A from early in the dictionary. We have ayar and yar, which is the masculine demonstrative pronoun. We have the word for blue sky, aktaka or ktaka. And these are cross-referenced in the dictionary, but they're not mentioned in the grammar, even though the author talks in other cases about morphological alternations and variations in the material. We have some forms where the rules are either not correct or where they're inconsistently applied. So, for example, the form martigi is listed as an exception in the grammar because it contains an R, and you expect final R forms to take yi as the plural marker. So, for example, consoir, horse, gives you the plural consoirii. But mart gives you something different. Of course, here the difference is that there's a cluster. So R is not actually final in the stem. RT is the final sequence, so it's T final. So you get the allomorph of the of the plural, which is appropriate to final consonants. And Pais doesn't seem to notice this, so he lists martigi as an exception. Okay, so again, this is odd if it's not that odd if it's someone who's coming to grips with the language for the first time. It's extremely odd if they are the author of that material. Okay, and finally, here's one more more complicated example. We have what Paiso calls a possessive particle, which is a prefix which is either gi or a gis, he says, so particle indicating possession. And he gives a form like gevorte, which is a word for stranger. He analyzes this as gi plus reduplication plus vorte. So vorte is the root to come, and the v, he says, is reduplication of that root, and then you get the prefix, which he says is either gi or gis. Based on the text, I think it's pretty clear that something else is going on. We have a prefix gis, gis, which is an agent nominalizer. So it produces nouns out of verbs. So it's not possession; it's nominalization of verbs. And this form is usually gis, but when the final when the root starts with a fricative or with a voiced consonant, it assimilates to that consonant, so it becomes that consonant. So you get gis when say the root begins with a T, but you get gif if it begins with an F, and you get give if it begins with a V. So here givorte is utterly regular from gis plus vorte. There's no reduplication or anything involved. And in fact, reduplication, Paiso describes reduplication in the grammar and shows that it's a CVC template. So you get the first consonant, the first vowel, and then the second consonant of the root. So the reduplicated form of vorte would be vorvorte. The V doesn't conform to either the data elsewhere in the grammar or to Paiso's own rules for reduplication. And so again, this is not surprising if someone's kind of fishing for forms, but it's very surprising if Paiso is the author of the forms like givorte in the first place. He must have had rules to generate the forms, and his rules in the grammar are inconsistent with the rules they're inconsistent with the rules that generated the texts in the first place. Okay, there are typologically unusual features, or at least typologically unusual for Europe in the grammar as well. So remember, previously we deduced that the author of the grammar is very familiar with the languages of Europe and imposed a European view on the material. But nonetheless, there are a number of features which are quite inconsistent with that. So, for example, we have an inclusive-exclusive distinction built on the first-person plural marker. So ho is the first person, G is the plural marker we've seen, and then you get exclusive thon hog, and inclusive thlu hog. So inclusive would be us all, and exclusive would be me and some others, but not you, not the people I'm talking to. Okay, and so this is pretty common in the world's languages, but it's pretty uncommon in Europe. We get auto-benefactive marking on the verb, so we get things done for someone's own interest, but not other people's interest. We get simultaneous tense prefixation and suffixation, so we get these circumfixes for tense where they mark slightly different categories. Again, not unknown elsewhere in the world, but relatively rare in Europe, where things are overwhelmingly suffixing. We find light verbs, pre-stems, pre-verbs, again, which Pais seems to struggle to describe. And so these are all features which simultaneously are indicative of some familiarity with, well, if it's a hoax, the author of this hoax should have been somewhat familiar with typology in general, but all the signs are that Pais was not particularly familiar with these sorts of categories, and in fact, Brinton suggests that they weren't that familiar. The authors of this grammar were not familiar with these materials. So we're left with this conundrum of whether these authors are typologically aware enough to include materials of this type, but not typologically aware enough to, say, realize that a final R feminine marker might be pretty suspicious to people when there's a number of other suspicious characteristics of this grammar. So we might either think they're typologically aware somewhat, but not aware enough to avoid simple errors like this, or maybe the writers of this grammar are simply doing a poor job on difficult materials, and so that's what we need to keep weighing up. It comes back to these sorts of things. Let's briefly now change tack a bit from linguistics to fraud, and consider the motives for a potential fraudulent grammar. So. We can, to do this, we can go perhaps away from linguistics to the KPMG Global Fraud Profile from 2016 and look at the reasons that fraudsters give for committing the frauds that they commit. And we find that they're pretty consistent, actually, across the array of financial embezzling, swindling, and so on and so forth. Basically, it's either for financial gain or power of some sort. So 2/3 of the respondents gave financial gain as a motive for the fraud that they committed, or to avoid some sort of negative consequences. So either to make someone's position better, to get more money, or to avoid the loss of money or status that covering up mistakes is basically most of the rest. So these numbers don't add up to 100% because some people gave more than one answer. So 66% was personal financial gain. Negative consequences, avoiding negative consequences was 35%. Because I can was about a quarter of the answers, to test the system or something like that, and then other was 10% of the examples, 10% of the reasons. So if we're dealing with fraud in this case, the motive pretty much has to have been, I guess, personal glory. You don't fake grammars for profit, right? So if it was personal glory, it's very odd that Pais didn't really go out of his way to defend it or do any sort of promotion beyond publishing the grammar. So again, something really doesn't add up there. So let me now summarize and go through each of these points. So the typological points, the grammatical characteristics, the original criticisms of Brinton don't stand up. And the similarities between the Taensa materials and French or Spanish could be, or indeed most probably are, due to the editorial interventions of Pais and Adam. And they say as much, that they added and expanded on the original material. The lexicon is, again, potentially indicative of not a forgery. So the lack of loans from Mobilian or Choctaw or Natchez or other languages of the region points towards a forgery. But we do find similarities with Timucua and languages further east. And those similarities point to, or indicate that this material is likely to be genuine. Particularly given that if they were planted as a forgery, they were never mentioned in the 19th century. The manuscript tradition definitely points to fraud, I would say. It's odd, it's fishy. The fact that the original manuscript couldn't be produced or they didn't want to produce it definitely points towards fraud, but I would say not decisively so. If we think of the number of manuscripts that get lost, if I think about the contents of my office, for example, I would be hard put to put my hands on materials that ask for specific papers, but nonetheless, the tradition of the actual manuscript is incredibly odd. And so you would think that someone would take better care of a manuscript of this type. The competence of the forgers, of the hoaxers. So they must have been clever to create the text. They must have had a pretty good knowledge of linguistics. But all signs were from the grammar that Pais, at least, wasn't a particularly good linguist, at least at that point. His later linguistic materials are careful and quite interesting, and he does a reasonably good job. But this grammar has inconsistencies, it has errors, it has problematic generalizations. He misses generalizations from the materials, and so on. And finally, the motive. Certainly no financial motive or motive based on power. The only possible motive is personal satisfaction, and so we might ask whether that's a plausible motive. So if I think about my undergraduates and whether I can imagine them say creating a language simply to find out whether they could. I think Harvard undergrads and Yale undergrads are pretty similar, I think, for this sort of thing. Yes, I can imagine them going to some lengths to creating a grammar. Can I imagine them publishing that grammar and going the extra steps? I find that a lot harder to think. So basically, let's just summarize the summary. So the grammatical material, the Taensa grammar, is a poor quality grammar. It's poor because of misgeneralizations and because of the use of European metagrammars. So that is, if it's a fake, it's a pretty obvious fake if we take that material at face value. The language materials, the texts and so on, show more internal complexity, more differences from the languages of Europe, and material that's not mentioned in the grammatical description. So the forgers, the creators of the hoax materials, must have been pretty experienced linguists to have come up with the original language materials. But we've deduced already that they weren't very good linguists because they created the grammar. So either they're really clever and they're doing it some sort of double jeopardy or something, or they're producing a poor job on materials that are difficult to work with. But if they're that clever, so if they're doing some sort of double blind with poor grammar, better materials, so if they're trying to do that and seeking to perpetrate a fraud on Americanists, why would they pick features that are so suspicious in the first place? So why, for example, would they create a grammar in Spanish when it would be so much more plausible to have a French grammar and so much easier for them? So we have these continual conundrums of this type. So basically over to you at this point. Do you think it's a fiction? Do you think it's a description? I think at least it's very much more than meets the eye and more than we've seen so far. So thanks very much, and I'll take questions.
I'm a psychologist, and the last 20 years have taught me anything is that above suspicion is just nonsense, right? That's actually exactly who you should suspect. And so he would have the knowledge, right? He might have a very different set of motives, like either to cover up a mistake or to see if he could get away with it, or because it made a point that he wanted to make. Is there something about the series of events that rules him out entirely?
I think the thing that rules him out is that, although again it's probably not conclusive, is that his attention was drawn to the 1880 publication by Vincent, who noted that and then brought his attention to it, and then he wrote to Pais to ask for more information. It's true that I believe there was quite significant antagonism between the European Americanists and the American Americanists. Certainly, Brinton. There was no love lost between Adam and Brinton and Swanton and so on. But I guess so I guess if Adam was the perpetrator of this hoax, he would have had to have planted the manuscript on either Pais or Amante, because Pais Senior was also involved, and that I think starts to get less plausible. So there's a protagonist I didn't mention who is Paisos' friend Antoine de Jouy, and I can only find the only mention I can find of him is in Brinton's work, and so Brinton claims that Paisos and de Jouy together came up with this material. So if most of the original material was from de Jouy and Paisos wrote the grammar, then we would have the separation between the people who the good linguists who made the material and the less experienced linguists who wrote the grammar. But I can't find anything about him. So the only mention of him is in Brinton's work. So that's also somewhat odd.
That was great. So when Pais finally returned to returned to Turkey, and he responded, what did he actually say? What was did he actively defend himself, or what was?
Kind of. So yeah, so he provides more information about the circumstances of what he did to the material. So he mentions that he compiled the dictionary, so the vocabulary of 600 or so items. That's apparently not in the original manuscript. He compiled it from a list of words that was organized by semantic field, and then he added the materials from the grammar, so the words that were in the grammar that were not in the dictionary, and words from the text that were not in the dictionary. And then in the course of that, he mentions that he had to guess at the translations in some cases. Adam also mentions that he removed from the manuscript that Paisos sent him some phrases that were not of benefit to science, if I remember right, is how he described it. So we don't know what's in that. So he doesn't. The impression I got from reading the subsequent letters was not that he particularly defended himself, but he certainly didn't throw up his hands and say, "You got me," or anything like that. Rather, it was, "Okay, here's what I did." Maybe by that point, with 3 years more experience of field work, and language documentation. Work, he realized more about the importance of either staying true to original sources or documenting the differences and so on. But so he documents the differences in more detail, but he certainly doesn't either really staunchly defend himself or give up or admit any sort of fakery. The impression that his material left me with after reading that was more that, okay, you don't believe it, I'm going to go off and do Syriac. That's what my passion and interest is. And okay, I've done this. Now I'm on to the next thing. So that I guess doesn't really speak either way. But yeah, it's odd that both that he does not defend himself further, but there are also others defending him. So Adam and Vincent are staunchly defending him, although at the same time saying he's not a very good linguist.
What do we know about the mayoral family library? When did they start collecting books? Where did the collection go? Is it still extant at all?
I don't know. This is the sort of thing it's relatively hard to find out just from the internet here. I do know that the mayoral house is no longer the mayor's house in Plombières. It's now, I think it's a bakery. If you look on Google Street View, there's certainly a row of shops in that area. There's a plaque there, but it's hard to read, so I assume that the plaque says something like this was once the mayor's house or something like that. This is an obvious next stage to look at. What happened to the family and to the material. There are still Paisos in Plombières. You can get the death notices from the local newspaper, and you can trace the family, and these names are still very much found in this region. So yes, that would be something to look at. The Paiso papers. He was a Benedictine priest, and Actually, I don't know that much about the Benedictines, but the groups, the missionary groups in Australia have pretty good archives on the whole, and members of the orders tend to deposit their scholarly papers there. So, for example, the Palatine Fathers in Melbourne have a gigantic archive of Australian materials from the early 20th century, reasonably well catalogued, very hard to get access to, but nonetheless, there in trunks and so on. The Trappist material all went back to France. The Bibliothèque Nationale has a lot of missionary materials, so these would all be places to look further. But yeah, it would be interesting to know if we can. Although of course Eastern France, in between the work of the First World War and the Second World War, there's been a fair amount of destruction between the Pais period and subsequently. So so I would also not be surprised if we couldn't find anything. I think there was another question further back. Was it? Yeah.
So supposing the materials to be genuine, right? Is it your impression that it would be a language isolate? If so, how plausible is that in itself, given the region? I mean, in some areas of the world, sometimes we'd be much more surprised to find isolates than in others. So, what do you think about that?
Right, yeah, so I think it's reasonably, of all of the areas in the US outside of California, the Southeast is the most reasonable place to find a language isolate. So if it were in New England, for example, I would be extremely surprised and extremely suspicious, given that we have so much documentation of Algonquian languages from Virginia and further south, north of Maine into Canada and so on, and west to the Dakotas. Finding an isolate in this region would be extremely surprising. Whereas for the Southeast, we have a number. So we both have a number of different families. We have materials of poorly recorded languages where their linguistic affiliation is not clearly relatable to other languages of the region. We also have evidence of language isolates, like Chitimacha, for example. That's an isolate. Although if you, I guess there's some claim that it's related to some languages of Mexico, but for our purposes, it's an isolate. Mary Haas has a really nice paper on basically on the families and isolates of the region. Natchez is an isolate. There's some claims that it's related to Muskegean, but it's not. Those claims don't really stack up. And so yeah, there's the short answer is yes. There are already a number of isolates in that region, and so adding another one is not implausible. So that was the second part of your question. Sorry, what was the first part of the?
Just when you think it is an isolate, what is your?
Oh, okay. Right, yeah, so it would have to be an isolate. There's actually a couple of grammatical forms that show some similarities to Timucua. Another isolate, of course, so Timucua is not related to other languages of the region. But the negation marker looks kind of similar. The past and future tense markers look somewhat similar, but they're single consonants, and so I would treat them as lookalikes rather than evidence of genetic relationship, and certainly none of the vocabulary that we can compare at this point looks remotely similar. One of my students compiled vocabulary lists of languages of the region for everything we could get our hands on, basically, and we looked at both low loan items and high loan items. So words like body parts, verbs, basic vocabulary that might be indicative of genetic relationship. And conversely, acculturation terms, plant and animal terms, other terms that we might expect to see loan words in. And the only thing we found any sort of similarity in was in some of the loan word terms, like the word for bird and the word for bear that I mentioned above.
Are there other famous unsolved cases of this sort?
Of hoaxes or
Things that we don't know.
Oh, we don't know anything. Yes, there are a lot of materials that where we have either remnants of the languages, and we're not sure how to classify them, or we have, say, textual materials from missionaries or travelers where we don't, where no one's really looked through them. For the hoaxes, I think most of the hoaxes at least the hoaxes we know about were identified very easily. So the Salmanazar example, for example, is very obviously a hoax. He was discovered with, he was greeted with increasing incredulity, and then basically dined off the hoaxness for the rest of his life. There was a New Guinea language description person whose name I can't remember now, but he has a series of quite extensive voyages where he describes the ship that he arrived on and the people he met and their customs and so on, all laboriously made up as works of fiction. No such boat ever existed. No such people are found anywhere in other records, and so on. But in terms of materials where we don't know what to do with them, yes, certainly. We have materials from the southeast, like Adai, and there's another vocabulary whose name I'm blanking on right now. But yeah, those materials are claimed variously to be Siouan or to be possibly Natchez. Taensa is another example, which might be Timucua, might be something else. The languages of Tasmania would be another good example, where we have about 10,000 words of vocabulary. We have these words, but we don't know. We have relatively little idea about how many languages those words are grouped into, and what the morphological structure is. We know that some of the recordings or some of the records were mixed because they were recorded from multiple sources, from multiple people on missions. We know that there was a lingua franca of Tasmanian languages, but we don't know which words belong to the lingua franca, which refer to earlier materials, and so on. So yeah, the documentary record is full of puzzles of this type.
But, so fine, we also think that we don't know exactly what
Right.
kind of, but something that has really, is alleged to be a hoax. It sounds like a very rare case, the one that you give.
Right. Yeah. Do you have a?
Jeremy mentioned some Bangani.
Oh, okay. Right. Yes, I've heard of
Bangani
Bangani.
is a purported Western type Canton Indo-European language in a little bit of northern India, and the discoverer claimed that he was introduced to this special subcode that survives only in particular prayers and chants that these people use and don't let outsiders hear except him. And it's become highly politicized with along national and cultural lines. There's definitely an odor of hoax there.
Right. In that case, someone else went to the region and tried to elicit the same sorts of structures, and didn't get anything.
Yeah, but then somebody else went and did.
Oh, okay. Oh no,
Fine,
there's
it's not quite so simple.
Right.
That's the general line of the direction. Can I just take this
Yeah.
moment to ask another question? So suppose it's real, okay? It's not a hoax. That means the Spanish manuscript is real.
right.
So who did? What do you know? What would our theory look like?
Right. So our theory would have to be a missionary. I think so it would have to be someone who had been in the region for enough time to write down 600 words, etc., plus the text, plus to get enough of the grammar to make it to be familiar enough with the grammar to make those sorts of generalizations. And so they would basically have to be a missionary. There are prayers which also points to missionary. They would have to be a Spanish missionary, given that it's in Spanish. And so that means they would have to have been somewhere in New Spain, I guess following the De Soto expedition, so somewhere between the late 16th century, late 1500s, and by the time that La Salle and Tonti and so on are there, and the area is under French control in the 1680s. So unless, of course, we're looking at a totally different part of the US. So if these Timucua loans are genuine, and we're looking at an area where the Taensa were in contact with Timucua, then we're talking much further east much further east and further north. So we're talking northern Florida or southern Georgia or possibly even western Georgia into Alabama if the Taensa material is Timucua. And in that case, we as in I at least don't know very much about that region. We know that there were missions. Of course, we know that there were Spanish missions throughout various parts of New Spain. We know that they were there for a while. We know that the Jesuits were expelled in 1735, if I remember right, and sent back to Spain where they weren't allowed to land, so they ended up all over Europe. So it's, that provides a possible conduit for a manuscript of this type to get from the Americas back to somewhere that's not Spain. So yeah, something along those lines would have to be what happened.
Just following up on Luca's question. So you said that it's not so implausible for Taensa to be an isolate because it's actually in that area you can have it. But then there are those other accounts suggesting that the Taensa spoke something like Natchez, but Natchez is also an isolate.
Right.
So I'm wondering how plausible it is to have a bilingual group speaking two isolate languages. So it means they're not really related to each other genetically. How could that come about?
Right. Yeah. So the Natchez were exogamous. They're one of the few groups in that region who were exogamous. So they're marrying people who spoke languages other than their own. So that's one reason. Also, we have numerous examples of regional powers of languages, regional powerful languages, which are not of themselves related to any others. So, for example, in northeastern Australia, Yolngu is a Pama-Nyungan language, but it's the only Pama-Nyungan language in that region. But it's nonetheless a lingua franca for a large number of groups. We have So I guess the isolate status versus related language status isn't so much about what languages are related to. The isolate status is of itself does not mean that a language could not be a regional language, regional powerhouse. That's more about the political dynamics of which groups are powerful. And we might expect that languages or groups that are more powerful might be larger, and if they're larger, they might be more subject to linguistic fragmentation, so they might have more dialects or more closely related languages associated with them. But I think that doesn't necessarily go hand in hand. That would be a tendency, but not an absolute. But the Natchez being exogamous is I think an interesting point here for that.
Because it's not the case that isolate can't be a lingua franca of the region. It's more like how would we end up with a small group being bilingual into languages that are not languages of related groups.
Oh, okay. Well, we also find groups being bilingual in their neighbors' languages, and those neighbors may or may not be powerful. So that of itself, I think, is not a huge problem with this story.
I was just going to say a pair of nearby isolates where you can easily imagine bilingualism.
Sumerian,
Japanese and Korean.
Oh, okay, right, and Sumerian in the ancient world as well. Yeah.
Hi, sorry, this is not about the lecture, but we have the room from 5:30 to 7:30, Seaver Hall 113.
This is
113.
This is
Yeah, 113.
Oh, I think it's 113.
113.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
All right. So,
Okay.
well, are we kind of ready to vote? Did we know about this? Did we know about this with the room? Nobody ever told us that. We'll end in a minute. Okay, thanks. All right.
So, any last questions?
Do we think this is a good time to stop? Okay, so keep in mind